Zeus and the Thundercloud crown. High above the mortal world, where the winds ran wild and clouds never stilled, stood the peak of Mount Olympus. Its summit was veiled in silver clouds that churned slowly, shifting in endless spirals. No mortal eyes had ever seen beyond that veil, for it was a place reserved for gods alone. Flashes of light pulsed within the misty mass, as if the clouds themselves carried a heartbeat of lightning. Each distant rumble of thunder rolled through the world below, soft but steady, like the low hum of a great drumbeat in the distance. The grand hall of Olympus rose from the mountaintop like a temple carved from the bones of the world. Its white marble columns soared higher than the tallest pines, and its great bronze doors shimmered like polished gold in the faint glow of divine light. Inside, the air smelled of fresh rain, mingled with the faint sweetness of ambrosia. All was still, but not for long. At the heart of the hall, seated upon a grand throne of polished stone, streaked with veins of gold and silver, was Zeus. His presence filled the space as a storm fills the sky, quiet but undeniable. His shoulders rested easily against the back of the throne, one arm draped across its armrest, his fingers tapping lightly as if to the rhythm of distant thunder. His gaze was sharp, eyes the gray of a storm-swept sea, and though his gaze was still, his thoughts were not. His brow creased ever so slightly as he stared into the distance, not at the walls of his hall, but beyond them. His gaze pierced the clouds, looking far, far below into the world of men. His eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. The cool click of footsteps echoed behind him. Hera approached, her gown flowing behind her like a river of golden silk. Her presence was regal, her gaze sharp as a falcon's. She came to stand at Zeus's side, her eyes following his toward the mortal world below. "You see it too, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but certain. "The altars have grown cold." Zeus did not answer right away. His gaze lingered on the view below, where temple after temple lay quiet. The sacred flames that once burned day and night on mortal altars had dimmed. The smoke that should have risen in curling streams of incense now rose only in faint, broken wisps. The echoes of prayers, once vibrant and strong, were now hollow, scattered like leaves blown by a careless wind. Once they called for rain, and the rain was given, Zeus muttered, his fingers still tapping the armrest. But now, their voices do not rise to Olympus. His gaze darkened, and a flicker of light sparked behind his eyes. Their hearts have turned. Hera stepped forward, her arms folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes followed his gaze, sharp and calculating. "No mortal forgets the gods without reason," she said. Her lips pursed as she tilted her head, listening to something far away. Then, softly, she added, "Do you hear it? A name carried on the wind." Zeus tilted his head slightly. His eyes narrowed, focused. The faintest sound echoed in the air. Not a voice, not a whisper, but something that moved through the space between sounds. It was subtle, like the first crack of ice on a still lake. Slowly, it grew clearer, forming a single name, Aetheron. The name was as sharp as a jagged stone, biting through the air like a splinter of broken glass. Zeus's gaze sharpened further, his fingers tapping one last time before curling into a fist. "A mortal," he said softly, his voice like the first rumble of thunder. "A name carried by the winds, a mortal who claims what is not his. His eyes turned to Hera, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze was like the weight of the sky itself. He dares to claim dominion over the sky. Hera's eyes flickered with quiet fury. "The skies belong to you, Zeus," she said firmly. "No mortal should stand where only gods tread." Zeus leaned forward, his shoulders rising slowly, his breath deep and deliberate. The calm stillness in him was gone. Now, he was like the air before a storm, silent but heavy. "I will see him for myself," he declared. His eyes, now bright as the first flash of lightning, gazed far beyond the hall, beyond the clouds, and down into the world of men. Hera tilted her head toward him, her gaze unwavering. "Will you go as a king?" she asked quietly. "Or as a man?" Zeus did not answer at first. His eyes scanned the world below as if weighing something unseen. Slowly, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Not a smile of joy, but the sharp, wild grin of a storm about to break. "As a man," he said at last. For a storm must be known not from above, but from within. He stood, and when he did, the whole hall seemed to shift. His cloak, once draped across his back, rose with the movement, the edges curling and shifting like gathering clouds. The faint light that shimmered around him grew brighter, flashing once, twice, like heat lightning on a summer night. He walked to the edge of the hall, past its great bronze doors, and out into the open air of Olympus. The clouds swirled around him, parting like waves split by a ship's prow. He glanced back once at Hera, his eyes steady but wild. "Watch the skies, Hera. You will know when I have arrived." With that, he stepped forward, and his body shifted. His cloak dissolved into swirling mist, his broad form shrinking, the glow of divine light around him dimming until only the rough figure of a mortal man remained. His eyes, however, did not change. Storm gray, sharp as ever, they gleamed beneath the hood of a weathered traveler's cloak. He stepped off the edge. There was no sound, no roar of descent, no grand display, only a single crackle of white lightning that flashed briefly across the clouds. Then he was gone. Above, the clouds churned, thick and brooding. A single thread of lightning danced between them, slow and deliberate, as if following the path of something unseen. The clouds swirled like the turning of a wheel, moving slowly, steadily, toward a storm. Hera watched it all, her eyes narrowed, her arms still folded. "Be swift, husband," she whispered, turning away. "Even the smallest storm can grow wild if left untended." The clouds closed once more, hiding the summit of Olympus in a veil of swirling silver mist. The rumble of thunder echoed once, then twice, louder and closer than before. Below, in the mortal world, the winds shifted. Farmers paused in their fields, tilting their heads toward the sky. Children looked up from their play, their small faces still and watchful. The clouds above Eros had begun to turn gray, slow and steady, like ink poured into water. But for now, the storm was distant. The world of men was quieter than Olympus, but not calmer. The air carried the sharp tang of dry earth, the distant chirping of cicadas, and the creak of weathered wood shifting in the wind. It was a place of weight, the weight of soil, of stone, of life bound to the ground. Here, men walked with the heaviness of toil, unlike the gods, who strode without burden. The first sound that broke the quiet was a soft crackle of lightning, not the sharp, wild flash that split the heavens, but a faint ripple like cloth tearing in the distance. The scent of rain, faint but present, drifted on the wind. Then, on the edge of the forest path, a figure appeared. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, as if each step were being tested for the first time. His frame was broad, but not towering. His cloak hung heavy on his shoulders, dull brown and frayed at the edges, like that of any wandering traveler. His feet pressed softly into the earth, leaving faint imprints in the dirt. As he walked, his gaze shifted from side to side, observing everything with sharp, precise movements. The faint glow of his storm-gray eyes was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. But for those who might have seen them, they would have known. This was no ordinary traveler. Zeus had come to the world of men. The path before him wound its way through a forest of gnarled oaks and crooked pines. Their branches formed a tangled roof above him, blocking much of the sun's warmth. Dappled light danced along the ground, moving as the leaves swayed with the soft breeze. He stepped forward without hurry, his eyes following the small details of the world. A trail of ants carrying leaves, the hollow whistle of wind weaving through the branches, and the faint rustle of unseen birds shifting in their nests. This world was not his, but it was familiar. The smell of wood smoke caught his attention next. Not the sharp bite of wildfires, but the steady, earthy scent of a hearth. He turned his head toward it, his gaze narrowing. Smoke meant people. People meant answers. The forest path widened, the trees pulling back like quiet spectators. Beyond, in a clearing, lay the small village of Iros. It was no grand city of marble like Thebes or Athens. No shining citadel crowned its hill. Iros was humble. Its homes were small, made of clay and wood, their thatched roofs heavy with dry grass. Goats wandered lazily between the homes, their bells clinking softly as they moved. But the village was not still. There was no laughter, no idle conversation. The square was filled with the quiet tension of people waiting for something to happen. Men carried buckets of water from a well that was nearly dry. Women gathered near doorways, whispering to one another, their eyes darting toward the sky. Children sat on low steps, their faces still and watchful, as if sensing a storm that had not yet come. The traveler stepped into the square. No one greeted him. No one called out. Most of them glanced at him once, then quickly looked away, eyes filled with unease. A stranger was just one more unknown in a world already too full of them. Zeus walked slowly, his eyes scanning the village. The signs of trouble were clear. The fields beyond the village lay gray and cracked, the soil brittle from drought. The stalks of wheat hung like wilted flowers, dry and broken. The well near the center of the square had been dug deeper, but even from a distance, Zeus could see the waterline had sunk too far. He approached the well, gazing into its depths. The faint glimmer of water at the bottom was still and lifeless, like a mirror reflecting a world of drought. He crouched low, his fingers brushing the dry rim of the well. They have asked for rain, he thought, his gaze hardening, and rain was not given. Looking for water, traveler? Zeus glanced up. An old man stood nearby, leaning on a crooked cane. His back was bent with age, and his beard was tangled, like the roots of an old tree. His eyes were small, but sharp, his gaze unwavering. Water is scarce in Eros, the old man continued, hobbling toward him. If you're thirsty, you'll have to wait like the rest of us. He tilted his head toward the sky. But maybe Aetheron will bring it soon. Zeus raised an eyebrow. "Aetheron?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The old man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You've not heard of him? He's the one who calls the clouds now." He tapped his cane on the ground, not like the old days, when we prayed at the altar. The old man gestured toward a weathered stone slab at the edge of the square. It was an altar, blackened by the ash of old offerings. No fresh fire had burned on it for some time. Zeus rose slowly, his eyes moving from the altar to the man. "And you trust this Aetheron?" he asked. The old man's smile faded. His gaze shifted, thoughtful but uneasy. "He brings rain," he muttered. "Or so it seems." His voice grew quiet. "But rain that touches nothing. It leaves the ground as dry as before." Before Zeus could reply, a hush swept over the square. The old man's face stiffened, his eyes darting to the road leading into the village. Every head turned in the same direction. The clinking of goat bells stopped. The distant chirping of cicadas faded. They heard it before they saw it. The rhythmic, deliberate tap-tap of footsteps on the dry, sun-baked path. They echoed louder than they should have, like each step struck stone rather than dirt. A figure emerged from the forest path. His cloak shimmered in the sunlight, deep blue like the midnight sky. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his stride slow but certain, like a man who expected all eyes to be on him. His face was too smooth, too sharp, as though it had been carved from polished marble. But his eyes were the most striking of all, gold, as if molten metal had filled his gaze. Aetheron. Zeus watched him with quiet patience, his eyes following every movement. "Show me," he thought. "Show me the root of your power." Aetheron strode into the square, his face serene, but his gaze piercing. He raised one hand, and the villagers, as if pulled by strings, turned their eyes to him. "People of Iros," Aetheron called out, his voice smooth as flowing honey, "raise your eyes to the heavens." His voice was soft but firm, like the first gust of wind before a gale. The villagers obeyed, eyes lifted to the sky. "Rain," he said with a grin, his hand rising slowly. "Rain, I call you." His hand twitched. The clouds above, once still and gray, shifted. Slowly, like the gears of a great machine, they began to move. His eyes flared gold, and his cloak fluttered behind him, as though caught by a sudden gust. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The villagers gasped. Mothers pulled their children close, eyes wide with awe. Then, a single drop, another. More followed, slow at first, then faster. Rain fell from the sky, pattering softly against the dirt. The villagers' eyes filled with wonder. Some knelt, some raised their hands, catching the drops on their palms. Children laughed and ran into the rain, letting it fall on their faces. But Zeus watched the ground. He crouched low, his gaze sharp as ever. The drops hit the dry soil, but they did not soak in. They vanished on contact, like mist burning away in the sun. The earth remained dry, its cracks unchanged. Hollow rain. The rain fell, but it was false. Zeus's eyes flicked to Aetheron. The sorcerer's grin had widened, his golden eyes gleaming with triumph. But Zeus saw it clearly now. The amulet at his neck, a small golden disc etched with twisting lines of ancient symbols. It pulsed faintly with each drop that fell. Not rain, Zeus thought. Not the sky. A trick of gold and glass. He rose slowly, his gaze never leaving Aetheron. His eyes, like storm clouds gathering at the edge of the horizon, grew sharper, colder. "You claim the sky, Aetheron?" Zeus thought, as he took one slow step forward. "Then, let me show you what it truly means to bear its weight." The rain had stopped, but the damp feeling lingered in the air. Drops clung to the eaves of houses and dripped slowly from leaves, but the ground beneath remained cracked and dry. The villagers hadn't noticed. Their eyes were still on Aetheron. Children giggled as they wiped droplets from their foreheads, and mothers whispered to each other about the sorcerer's greatness. "Did you see it?" a young man said, his eyes wide with awe. "Rain!" "Rain from his hand. Rain from the skies," an older woman corrected, gazing up as if expecting more drops to fall. "He commands the clouds. No mortal can do that." Zeus, still disguised as the hooded traveler, stood in the shadow of an old olive tree. His gaze moved from the villagers to the ground. They see rain, but they do not see the truth. The soil beneath the raindrops was unchanged, dry, hard as stone. The air was wet, but the earth remained thirsty. He stepped forward. His pace was slow but deliberate, his feet crunching softly on the dry dirt. The villagers, caught in their conversations, barely noticed him until he spoke. "Does the rain quench your fields?" Zeus asked, his voice calm but clear, cutting through the quiet murmurs like a crack of distant thunder. Several villagers turned, their eyes narrowing with confusion. The old man, Ormenos, who had spoken with Zeus earlier, glanced toward him, his face sharp with recognition. He raised a hand, squinting as if trying to place the traveler's voice. "What did you say?" asked a burly man carrying a half-empty water jug. He frowned, tilting his head. Zeus stepped forward again, his cloak swaying behind him like a slow-moving cloud. "Does the rain quench your fields?" he repeated. His eyes scanned the ground, where faint puddles shimmered on the surface of the soil. He crouched, his fingers pressing into the dirt. It crumbled at his touch, dry, brittle, unchanged. He lifted the dry earth in his palm, holding it up for all to see. "It touches your faces, but not your soil." The villagers stared at the dry dirt in his hand. Confusion flickered across their faces. A child tilted her head. A woman glanced at her husband, brows knitted in doubt. "That's nonsense," a sharp voice called out. Aetheron strode forward, his cloak of midnight blue trailing behind him. His golden eyes locked onto Zeus with quiet fury. "The rain is real. You felt it on your skin, didn't you?" He raised his hands, his fingers curling into fists. "Do not let a wandering fool twist your minds." The villagers glanced at one another, doubt creeping in like the slow rise of fog. Some of them stepped back, their gazes flitting between Zeus and Aetheron. Ormenos, leaning on his cane, raised his voice. "It's true," he said, nodding slowly. "The rain touched my face, but not my field. My feet are still standing on dust." He tapped the ground with his cane, and the hollow thud echoed louder than any argument. Aetheron's gaze snapped toward Ormenos, his eyes narrowing like a hawk tracking prey. His lips curled into a thin smile. "Old eyes see only what they expect," he said softly, his tone as smooth as flowing water. He raised his hands once more, his voice rising with false warmth. "Let me show you the power of certainty." His fingers spread wide, and the amulet around his neck pulsed faintly. The villagers felt it before they saw it. The shift in the air, the faint pressure on their skin, like the first breath of wind before a storm. Above, the clouds began to twist again, slow at first, then faster, like a whirlpool in the sky. The children gasped. Women clutched their shawls. Men watched with wary eyes. Aetheron tilted his head back, his face illuminated by flashes of gold. His voice was steady and firm. "Look to the sky," he called out. "Do you not see it bending to my will?" The villagers' eyes lifted, their gazes filled with awe and fear as a streak of lightning flickered in the clouds above. The slow rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. "Look how it moves for him," someone whispered. "Lightning!" cried a boy, his eyes wide with excitement. The glow of the amulet pulsed harder now, flickering in time with the flashes above. Zeus's eyes caught the rhythm, the subtle synchronization between the amulet's light and the pulse of the clouds. Not control, he thought. Imitation. The clouds were not moving of their own accord. They were responding to the magic, following like leaves caught in a whirlpool. Zeus took one step forward. "If power is so great," he said calmly, his gaze locked on Aetheron, "then it should stand against questions, not silence them." Aetheron's eyes flicked to him, his smile twitching into a sneer. "I answer with action," he said, his voice sharp. He raised both arms, and with a flick of his wrist, a bolt of golden lightning cracked down from the clouds. It struck the old oak at the edge of the square with a crack. Splinters of wood flew, and a sharp gasp rippled through the villagers. Children hid behind their mothers. The old oak, scarred but still standing, smoldered as thin tendrils of smoke curled into the sky. Silence fell. The villagers stared, their eyes wide, their breath caught in their chests. A woman whispered, "He called it down from the sky." Zeus glanced at the broken tree, his face still as stone. He stepped forward, his eyes meeting Aetheron's. His voice was low but clear, each word as deliberate as a measured drumbeat. "That was thunder," Zeus said, his eyes narrowing. "But thunder is loudest just before the rain." He crouched low, his fingers brushing the dirt again. He did not raise it this time. He let it rest in his palm, loose and dry. "If the storm is yours, Aetheron," he said quietly, his eyes lifting to meet the sorcerer's, "then bring the rain." The villagers' eyes turned to Aetheron. Their gazes, once filled with awe, now carried something colder. Expectation. Aetheron's face tensed. He blinked, his fingers twitching. The amulet pulsed once, but slower this time, like a fading heartbeat. His eyes flicked to the villagers, then back to Zeus. His lips parted, but no words came. "Bring the rain," Zeus repeated, standing slowly, his cloak swaying behind him. "Not the lightning, not the roar of thunder. Bring the rain that feeds the soil." He lifted his gaze to the villagers. "If he commands the sky, then the sky will answer him." But if the sky is silent? He let the sentence trail off, his eyes resting firmly on Aetheron. The villagers watched with growing stillness. Their awe had shifted. Doubt had found its way into their faces. A mother, still holding her child close, furrowed her brow. Ormenos's eyes narrowed. The burly man with the water jug folded his arms, his gaze colder than before. Aetheron raised his hands. His lips parted to speak, but the words never came. The amulet flickered faintly at his chest, but the sky remained still. The clouds, once so willing to turn and flash with lightning, hung motionless. No flash, no roar, no rain. Silence. One of the children, a small girl with wide brown eyes, stepped forward. Her gaze stayed on the sky. "It's not raining," she said quietly. Her words echoed louder than thunder. The villagers began to murmur. "Not raining. No water on the ground. It's dry." Aetheron's eyes darted wildly. He raised his hands again, his fingers stiff with panic. "The rain will come," he snapped. "The storm is mine." His eyes flared gold as he thrust his hands toward the sky. Nothing moved. Zeus took another step forward. His eyes, calm and sharp as a knife's edge, did not leave Aetheron. "Power," Zeus said quietly, his voice steady but firm, "does not beg." The air grew still, not the stillness of peace, but the sharp, brittle stillness that comes before a storm. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the goats, usually so restless, stood frozen as if sensing that something unseen had entered the village. Aetheron's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling too quickly for a man so confident. His hands remained raised toward the sky, fingers twitching with the strain of unseen effort. The faint, golden glow of his amulet flickered like a candle fighting against the wind. Nothing moves, Zeus thought, his eyes sharp with quiet observation. The sky waits for no man. The villagers watched him now, their faces filled with something that had not been there before, doubt. They glanced at the gray sky above, at the dry earth below, and finally at Aetheron, whose fingers trembled like the strings of a loose lyre. The young girl, the one who had spoken earlier, tilted her head, her wide eyes unblinking. "It's not raining," she repeated softly. The crack in their belief had widened. Aetheron's gaze darted from face to face, his jaw tight, his teeth clenched, as if he could hold back his rising panic by sheer force of will. He raised his voice, louder this time, like a man trying to drown out his own fear. "You doubt me?" he snarled, his golden eyes narrowing into sharp slits. "Do you not see what I command? Have you forgotten the lightning that split the tree?" He turned, his cloak swirling behind him like a gust of wind, his eyes locking onto Zeus with a fiery glow. "You," he hissed, pointing a rigid finger. "You think yourself wise, don't you, traveler? A man with questions, but no power to answer them." His eyes flared brighter, his hand raised high. "Shall I show you the answer?" Zeus did not move. He stood still, as unmoving as a mountain beneath the clouds. The shadows of his hood concealed his face, but his eyes, sharp as storm-tossed waves, watched every flicker of Aetheron's fingers. "Show me," Zeus said softly. His voice was calm, quieter than the wind, but it carried more weight than the crack of thunder. "Show them all." Aetheron's lips twisted into a grin. His arms shot upward, fingers spread wide, like the talons of a hawk. The amulet at his chest blazed with golden light, bright as molten metal fresh from the forge. The villagers gasped, shielding their eyes as the glow intensified. The sky above shifted. Slowly, the clouds began to spin in a wide spiral, the motion slow but unmistakable. A circle formed in the heart of the sky, a swirling whirlpool of gray clouds with a hollow center of pale blue. The villagers' gasps grew louder. They see movement, Zeus thought. But movement is not rain. Aetheron turned, his arms still raised, his eyes wild with triumph. "Behold the storm that answers to me," he cried, his voice rising like the howl of a gale. "Bow before the one who commands the sky itself." The villagers watched, their eyes flicking from the spinning clouds to Aetheron. Their awe was thinner this time, their gazes sharper, more cautious. The old man Ormanos stood with his arms folded, his eyes like a hawk's watching a wounded animal. He did not bow. Then it came. With a flash of gold and white, a spear of lightning split the sky. It struck the ground not far from the edge of the village square. The crack of impact echoed through the air like a blow from a warhammer. Splinters of wood flew as the bolt hit an old cart, splitting it in half. The villagers cried out, backing away from the smoldering wreckage. The silence after the blast was heavier than the thunder itself. Aetheron lowered his arms slowly, his breaths shallow but victorious. He turned, his smile wide, his golden eyes shining like twin flames. "This is power," he declared, his voice smooth and certain once more. His eyes scanned the crowd, watching them shift nervously. "Do you see now? The gods are silent, but I am not." He raised his arms again. "Bow, and the rain will come." One man knelt, then another. Slowly, more followed, their eyes lowered, their hearts heavy with fear. Fear, Zeus thought, his gaze sharp as a blade. Not belief, fear. The old man Ormanos did not bow. His eyes flicked to Zeus, and in that moment, Zeus knew the doubt had taken root. They see it too. Aetheron turned to face Zeus fully now, his grin thinner, but his pride still unshaken. "And you, traveler," he called, his voice sharp and taunting. "Will you bow, or shall I split the ground beneath your feet?" Zeus raised his head slowly, his eyes glowing faintly from beneath the shadow of his hood. "You claim to hold the storm," he said, his voice quiet but firm, each word like the first drop of rain on stone. He stepped forward, his feet pressing firmly into the dry dirt. "But tell me this, Aetheron." The villagers turned toward him, their gazes flicking between Zeus and Aetheron. The air shifted, heavy but still. "Do you hold the sky?" Zeus asked, his eyes now fully visible, sharp and silver gray like the edge of a storm. "Or does it hold you?" Aetheron blinked, his face twitching with confusion. "What nonsense is this?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I am the storm. I am its master." "Then show them," Zeus said, his voice steady as stone. He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing like the tightening of a storm's eye. His cloak began to shift, the edges of the fabric curling faintly, like mist. "If you are master of the sky, then hold it yourself." The air grew colder. The villagers glanced at each other, unease growing like the slow rising of floodwater. Aetheron's hands twitched. The glow of the amulet flickered. Zeus's eyes locked on Aetheron. Slowly, he raised his hand, fingers splayed, his palm open to the sky. His cloak, once a simple fabric of dull brown, shimmered faintly at the edges, flickering like a storm cloud lit from within. Aetheron's eyes widened. "No," he whispered, his voice hollow with recognition. "No, it can't be." Zeus lifted his hand higher. Lightning flashed across the sky, not golden like Aetheron's conjurations, but sharp, white, and pure. The clouds above shifted, moving not in spirals but in broad, sweeping waves, like the slow churn of the open sea. Thunder rolled, deep and slow, not sharp like Aetheron's display, but vast, like a mountain shifting in its sleep. Aetheron stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly. "No, no, no!" he hissed, his hands raised as if to shield himself from the sight. Zeus stepped forward, His voice boomed like a crack of thunder. "You sought to wear the crown of the sky, mortal." His eyes blazed with stormlight, his presence filling the air like a gathering hurricane. "Then bear it." With one smooth motion, Zeus flung his hood back. His hair, once hidden, shimmered like rain-slicked clouds. The glow in his eyes intensified. The villagers gasped, but none of them knelt this time. Their eyes were wide, not with awe, but with certainty. They knew now. Zeus raised his right hand, and the clouds churned with him. The lightning gathered, not one bolt, but 100 flashes of white fire sparking in every direction. His eyes were locked on Aetheron. "You claim the sky, but the sky claims you," Zeus said, his voice rumbling like thunder over the sea. "Return to the dust." He brought his hand down, but not to strike. He lowered it slowly, his eyes never leaving Aetheron. His presence alone was enough. The storm obeyed. The air grew colder. The clouds swirled faster, and rain, real, steady rain, began to fall. Not a spell, not an illusion. The villagers felt it at once. It soaked the ground, turning dust to soil, cracks to smooth earth. They knelt, but not in fear. Mothers raised their children into the rain. Aetheron's amulet dimmed. His eyes dimmed with it. His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the wet soil. He looked up at Zeus, his eyes hollow now, empty of fire. "Power," Zeus said, his gaze unblinking, "is not in the storm you summon, but in the one you command." The storm rumbled, but only once. Quiet, firm, final. The rain fell softly at first, steady, patient, and full of weight. No hollow illusions this time. Real rain. Cool, fresh, and unyielding, it soaked into the dry earth, filling every crack and crevice. Where the dirt had once been brittle as old parchment, it now grew dark and rich. Tiny rivulets of water traced quiet paths through the soil, winding their way to the roots of trees and the seeds buried below. The village of Eros stood still. No one spoke. No one dared to move, as though breaking the silence might end the rain. Mothers pulled off their scarves, tilting their faces upward to feel the drops on their skin. Children laughed, arms outstretched as they spun in slow circles, catching the rain on their tongues. Some of the men knelt, pressing their hands into the damp soil, letting it stain their fingers as if to be certain it was real. Ormenos crouched near the altar, his old hands gripping the edge of the stone. He ran his fingers through the wet earth below it, his eyes narrowed with focus. His lips pressed into a line, then parted in a slow, trembling smile. "Water in the soil," he whispered. His fingers curled into the ground, lifting the damp earth to his face. Not on the air, not on the skin. The soil drinks it now. The old man looked up slowly, his gaze locking on Zeus. His eyes held no fear, only quiet certainty. He nodded once, as if to say, "I see you now." Aetheron knelt in the mud, his once pristine cloak soaked through, clinging to him like seaweed caught on a broken mast. His hair hung in wet strands across his face, his hands limp in his lap. His eyes, once glowing with golden fire, were now dull as tarnished bronze. The amulet that had once pulsed with power lay in the dirt before him, cracked into 3 jagged pieces. He stared at it in silence, his breath shallow and uneven. Zeus approached him slowly. Each step was deliberate, each footfall pressing firmly into the soft, wet ground. His cloak, once dull and worn, now shimmered faintly at its edges. The glow from his storm-gray eyes had softened, no longer wild, but steady, like the glow of embers after a fire has burned low. Aetheron did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the broken pieces of his amulet, his face slack with disbelief. His fingers hovered over the shards, but did not touch them. He did not need to. He knew it was over. "You sought to command the storm," Zeus said softly, his voice calm but firm. It was not loud, yet every villager heard it as clearly as if he had spoken directly to them. "But you built your crown on glass and gold, things that break." Aetheron's breath hitched. His fingers curled slowly, clawing at the dirt. "I only wanted them to see me," he muttered, his voice hoarse and raw. His eyes flickered upward for a brief moment, filled with shame. "I wanted them to know my name." Zeus crouched before him, his knees pressing into the soft ground. For a moment, they were eye to eye, one who had fallen and one who had risen. Zeus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering but calm. "The world remembers storms," he said, his voice low, like distant thunder, "but only because of the rain they bring." He reached out, his hand open but not commanding. His fingers hovered just above the broken shards of the amulet. Slowly, his thumb pressed down on the largest piece, and with a faint crunch, it crumbled into dust. The glow it once held flickered and died, the last ember snuffed out. Aetheron bowed his head. His hands fell to his sides, empty and limp. His shoulders shook once, then twice, as if a weight had finally been lifted, or perhaps as if he had only now realized how heavy it had been. "Go," Zeus said quietly, his eyes still on Aetheron. His voice was not cruel, but it held no softness either. "Go back to the world of men, not as a king, but as one of them." Aetheron's breath was shallow, his eyes downcast. Slowly, he rose to his feet. His head remained bowed, his eyes fixed on the ground. The villagers watched him in silence. No one jeered. No one cursed him. They only watched as he stepped away, walking toward the edge of the village, his cloak hanging like dead weight on his back. He did not look up. The villagers' eyes turned next to Zeus. This time, there was no awe. There was no fear. There was something far quieter. Reverence. One by one, the villagers turned to each other. Ormenos bent down and dug his fingers into the damp soil once more. He lifted it to his nose, inhaling the scent of rain and soil mixed together, the scent of growth, of life. He nodded slowly, then turned to the other villagers. "Go," he said, his voice firmer now. "Back to the fields, to the seeds." The rain has come, but only our hands will bring the harvest. The men glanced at one another, their faces thoughtful but resolute. They stepped forward, their eyes cast toward the distant fields. Some of the women picked up their children and brushed the dirt from their hands, but not from their faces. No one asked where Aetheron had gone. No one needed to. The rain fell steady now, not wild or fierce, but soft and true. Water pooled in shallow dips in the ground, seeping slowly into the soil. It soaked into the roots of trees, dripping from leaves in steady beats. No longer a display, no longer a threat. It was simply rain. Real rain. Zeus gazed at the villagers for a long moment. They did not kneel. They did not bow. They stood, watching, waiting. Their eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but with purpose. Zeus's gaze lingered on the young girl, the one who had seen through the illusion first. She stood by her mother's side, eyes upturned toward him, wide and unblinking. Her gaze did not falter. She saw him clearly, and she did not look away. He smiled. It was a small smile, faint as the first break of dawn. His eyes lifted to the sky. The clouds had shifted from gray to soft silver. Beams of pale sunlight pierced through in quiet rays, lighting patches of the forest and village below. Raindrops fell slowly through the glow of the sun, tiny beads of light that shimmered before vanishing into the soil. The storm had broken. The rain remained. Zeus turned away from them, his gaze cast toward the open road beyond the village. He took a step forward, then another, his feet moving with the quiet purpose of a man who had walked many long roads. His cloak shifted as he walked, its edges curling like mist. One moment he was walking, the next he was gone. No flash of lightning, no roar of thunder, no grand display, just a faint, sharp crackle of air, and then nothing. But the rain did not stop. As you close your eyes, let the echoes of this story guide you to peace. Drift gently into sleep, knowing you are part of a world where love and wisdom shine bright. May your dreams be calm, comforting, and filled with wonder.